Instantly claiming central territory, this pawn advance initiates a fundamental struggle for board dominance. Boldly contesting the center, this Sicilian counterstrike immediately injects asymmetry and sets the stage for a dynamic, unbalanced struggle. Developing a knight here stakes a claim in the center and prepares for rapid development of the kingside pawn structure. This solidifies black's pawn chain, contesting the center and preparing to develop the bishop. Unleashing a central pawn thrust, white immediately challenges black's queenside space and seeks to open lines for attacking play. Exchanging pawns opens lines, creating immediate tactical possibilities and impacting central control. Knight poised for central dominance, initiating development and threatening initiative. Developing this knight now initiates central counterplay and challenges white's central pawn. Establishing a solid pawn center and developing knights harmoniously positions white for active play. Preparing a kingside expansion, while subtly preventing the bishop's influence on the long diagonal. Opening the f-file offers attacking potential, but weakens the king's dark squares. Instantly centralizing the queen, black prepares to challenge white's pawn chain and activate her pieces towards the kingside. Securing the king's diagonal with the bishop proactively prepares for castling, while also eyeballing key central squares. Building the dragon's wing, preparing for fianchetto, a defensive rampart against the coming storm. Securing the monarch initiates a pivotal defensive maneuver, consolidating your king's safety while preparing for potential central or queenside expansion. Developing the bishop to its most active diagonal, preparing for potential kingside pressure and solidifying control of the center's edge. Reasserting central influence, this knight repositions, anticipating potential breakthroughs while preparing for a fluid development. Fortifying the knight's position and preparing for potential d5 pawn pushes creates a solid defensive structure. Securing space on the queen side, white begins to restrict black's development and prepare for potential pawn advances. Securing the king feels right, though it does pass up a chance to develop another piece or challenge white's central influence immediately. Preparing a queenside expansion, while the king remains uncastled in this Sicilian setup, demands careful consideration of black's counterplay. Preparing to challenge white's queenside space and aiming to activate the queenside majority with a pawn advance. Unleashing the queen towards the kingside hints at an aggressive pawn storm, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive development. Developing the bishop to b7 creates an immediate diagonal threat, potentially putting pressure on white's kingside while coordinating with the queenside majority for central influence. Consolidating the king's safety, this repositioning guards against potential early pressure along the h-file and prepares for future pawn advancements. Solidifying the center and preparing for a potential kingside advance, this establishes a robust pawn chain. Shifting the bishop to that square aims to bolster the kingside and possibly prepare a future pawn storm advance. Shifting the rook to the e-file enhances potential pressure on the center and prepares for future pawn pushes. Reinforcing the central pawn and preparing for potential e5 advances, this quiet maneuver consolidates white's space. Embracing the flank, nc5 immediately contests central space and prepares for an offensive push towards white's somewhat exposed king. Unleashing the kingside attack, this pawn sacrifice cracks open lines, aiming to expose black's monarch and exploit the d6 weakness. Sacrificing the knight opens a decisive diagonal for white's queen and bishop, threatening the kingside. Opening the c-file for aggressive pawn thrusts and potential harassment of black's queenside structure. Relocating the knight to d7 avoids further pawn structure issues and prepares for potential e5, aiming to centralize the piece. Striking at the dark-squared bishop immediately isolates black's king's defense. Shielding the king's diagonal is paramount now, lest the bishop on h6 exploit its exposure. Clearing a vital diagonal for the queen, this exchange sacrifices a bishop's influence to sharpen the assault on black's weakened kingside. The king now occupies a more open diagonal, but this repositioning aims to activate pieces and shore up kingside defenses. Opening the f-file creates immediate pressure on black's king and potentially clears a path for future queenside activity. Opening the e-file allows the rook to penetrate, putting pressure on white's king position and forcing a reassessment of defensive structures. Opening the d-file dramatically reshapes the central pawn structure and aims to activate the rook. Reclaiming the e-file, black reinforces the defense of the castled king and prepares for potential pawn advances on the queen side. Recentering the queen sets up potential advances on the king side and increases pressure along the open files, aiming to exploit the somewhat exposed black king. Centering the rook on the 7th rank now prepares to challenge open files and potentially create mating threats against white's uncastled king. Asserting control of the open c-file, this move prepares to exert pressure along the entire rank. Shifting the queen back to a more active central square prepares for potential breaks and defends the king side. Cracking open the center here promises exciting complications for both sides. Protecting the king but neglecting the queen side opens avenues for white's rooks. Reinforcing the d4 pawn, this knight aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and eye the vulnerable queen side. Reclaiming the center, this knight hop aims to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially pry open the d-file for future action. Maintaining central pressure, the queen aims to exploit the weakened kingside by repositioning for an attack along the h-file. Dislodging the knight from its strong central post initiates a potentially risky pawn storm, leaving the king's defenses temporarily exposed. Recapturing with the queen redirects its defensive gaze away from the vulnerable kingside, potentially allowing black's bishop to become more active. A strategic repositioning, aiming to redeploy the queen for a more active role and potentially unlock new attacking avenues along the center. Initiating a decisive pawn thrust to disrupt black's cramped position. Preparing to challenge that central pawn blockade, aiming to re-establish dynamic piece play. Refocusing knight activity on the king side, aiming to disrupt black's solid pawn structure and prepare for a potential breakthrough. Re-establishing the knight's influence on the king side offers crucial defensive coverage and future attacking potential. Shifting the queen back allows for a potential central pawn push, aiming to unravel black's somewhat passive setup. A crucial repositioning to consolidate the knight's influence and prepare for a potential queenside push. A bold expansion on the queenside, aiming to seize space and disrupt black's pawns. Focusing on piece activity, this move tucks the rook behind the pawn, preparing for a potential regrouping or future counterplay along the e-file. Shifting the knight to g3 aims to reinforce the kingside and eye potential advancements on the kingside. Challenging the central pawn, seeking to disrupt white's advancing structure and create counterplay on the c-file. Expanding the queenside pawn chain to gain space and potentially open lines against black's solid setup. Opening the c-file now is a vital counterplay, forcing white to defend against immediate threats on the semi-open file. Reclaiming the open file is crucial for centralized pressure. A daring counterattack seeks to destabilize white's queen. Shifting the rook to the 1st rank opens up vital attacking lines against black's vulnerable king. Opening up the queenside now invites immediate threats to the central pawn structure. Capturing the pawn opens a dangerous diagonal, potentially threatening black's unsupported queen. Reclaiming the diagonal, this bishop actively eyes white's queenside and prepares for potential counterplay. Unpinning the queen, this aims to redeploy forces and challenge the initiative. A calculated redeployment of the queen, seeking to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and perhaps prepare a counterattack. Recapturing the pawn simplifies the position, leading towards an endgame where the queen's activity will be paramount. Exchanging queens opens up the possibility of a sharp kingside attack for white. The rook now claims its rightful open file, a classic endgame maneuver to secure dominant placement. Introducing the rook to the semi-open file offers a new avenue for pressure, aiming to exploit white's potentially weak pawns. Opening the file creates immediate pressure on black's queenside pawns. Consolidating the rook's position on the open b-file offers better defensive coverage for the remaining pawns. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure aims to secure the monarch and prevent immediate breakthroughs. The bishop aims to support the rook's advance while eyeing potential weaknesses on the queenside. Securing the 7th rank with the rook immediately cuts off black's queenside play and forces a decisive reaction.